Why was James Joyce's Ulysses banned in the United States?
Irish writer James Joyce's 1882–1941 masterpiece was originally published in 1922. It had been serialized prior to then. By the Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company. By 1928 it was officially listed as obscene by the U.S. Customs Court. The reason was twofold. The use of four-letter words and the stream of consciousness narrative of one of the characters, revealing her innermost thoughts. When the official stance on the book was challenged in U.S. court in 1933, the judge, John Woolsey, called it a sincere and honest book. And after long reflection he ruled that it be openly admitted into the United States. Random House, the American publisher who had advocated the obscenity charge be challenged in court, promptly began typesetting the work in order to release a U.S. edition. But the court decision had important and lasting legal impact as well. It was a turning point in reducing government censorship. Prior to the case, laws that prohibited obscenity were not seen to be in conflict with the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is most often interpreted as a guarantee of freedom of speech. And the U.S. Post Office and the Customs Service alike both had the power to determine obscenity. The government appealed the decision to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. But Judge Woolsey's decision held.
How old are card games?
Card games are believed to have originated in China in about A.D. 800. By the late 1200s cards had made their way to Italy, perhaps carried aboard merchant ships, and from there spread to other parts of Europe. The present-day variety of four suits, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades was adopted in France during the 1500s.
Why is Moby Dick considered the greatest American novel?
The 1851 novel by Herman Melville, 1819–1891, which opens with the familiar line "Call me Ishmael," has been acclaimed as one of the greatest novels of all time. Many regard it as the best American novel. Of course, determining the best is a purely subjective matter, and Melville's work has many worthy rivals for the distinction, but Moby Dick remains a compelling and finely wrought work in spite of the fact that it was not appreciated in its day. The story of a whaling captain's obsessive search for the whale that ripped off his leg. Moby Dick is both an exciting tale of the high seas and an interesting allegory, interpreted as the human quest to understand the ultimately unknowable ways of God. The work first received notoriety some 30 years after Melville's death.
How did cable TV develop?
The industry had its beginnings in the 1970s, when home box office HBO started to beam its signal to customers on a subscription basis. It was a radical concept: let audiences pay direct for the programming, in this case, movies, rather than having it wholly supported through advertising and, in some cases, syndication fees. Another development during that decade proved to have lasting effect: Southern businessman Ted Turner, 1938, bought an independent TV station based in Atlanta and dubbed it a superstation. WTBS was soon made available to some 10 million subscribing households and was the beginning of Turner's cable TV empire, which would later include cable news network, CNN, CNN's headline news, Turner Network Television, TNT, and, briefly, the music network VH1. Soon there were a number of niche-based cable networks airing programming around the clock: music television, MTV, was reaching teens and 20-somethings, Lifetime targeted women, ESPN focused on sports, black entertainment television. BET catered to the African American audience, and American movie classics, AMC, appealed to a cross-section of American viewers who share a fondness for old, mostly black and white, movies. By the 1980s, the three major television networks, which had risen to power in the 1950s and had remained on the top of their game for the next 2 decades, found that their audience share was dropping. This was aided by the introduction of the upstart Fox television network, backed by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, 1931. Fox's programming, geared toward a young, hip, and increasingly multicultural audience, found its own following. Soon Americans had more choices than ever before, and for a relatively low subscription cost. By the 1990s, the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, were reaching only 61% of the television audience. Not to be beaten at their own game, the networks responded to the new competition by producing more cutting-edge shows, programs that likely would not have made it on the air before the advent of cable. Further, they began charging their affiliate stations for programming, a trend begun by CBS in 1992.
When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent, the most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers, was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
When did American poetry begin?
As the self-described poet of democracy, Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892, was the first to compose a truly American verse, one that showed no references to European antecedents, throwing off both the narrative and ode forms of verse, and that clearly articulated the American experience. His first published poetry was the self-published collection Leaves of Grass, 1855. In an effort to gain recognition, Whitman promptly sent a copy to the preeminent man of American letters, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803-82, who could count as his acquaintances and friends the great British poets William Wordsworth, 1770-1850, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772-1834, the renowned Scottish essayist Thomas Carlyle, 1795-1881, and prominent American writers Henry David Thoreau, 1817-1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804-1864. It was a bold move on Whitman's part, but it paid off, while Leaves of Grass had been unfavorably received by reviewers. Emerson composed a 5-page tribute, expressing his enthusiasm for the poetry and remarking that Whitman was at the beginning of a great career. Thoreau, too, praised the work. More than a century later, biographer Justin Kaplan acclaimed that in its time Leaves of Grass was the most brilliant and original poetry yet written in the New World. At once the fulfillment of American literary romanticism and the beginnings of American literary modernism. Whitman's well-known and frequently studied poems include Song of Myself, O Captain, My Captain, Song of the Open Road, and I Sing the Body Electric. While she was virtually unknown for her poetry during her lifetime, Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886, was writing at about the same time as Whitman, the 1850s, publishing only a handful of poems before her death. Collections of Dickinson's works were published posthumously, and today she, too, is regarded as one of the great early poets of the United States. Had more of her work been brought out in print, perhaps she would have been recognized as the first truly American poet.
When was public broadcasting started?
In the United States it was started in 1967, when the Public Broadcasting Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. 1908 to 1973, on November 7. Creating a corporation for public broadcasting to broaden the scope of non-commercial radio and TV beyond its educational role. Within 3 years, and as a result of federal grants, plus funds from foundations, business, and private contributions, Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, rivaled the big three networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, for viewers. In England, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, took control of the development of television in 1932, launching BBC TV. The BBC had been founded as a radio broadcaster in 1922 under the leadership of English engineer John Charles Reith, 1889 to 1971. Reith remained at the helm of the BBC for 16 years after its founding, and under his guidance, it became one of Britain's most revered institutions, supported by the public with license fees.
Why was the Medici family important to Renaissance art?
The Medici family was powerful in Florence, Italy, between the 14th and 16th centuries. The founder of the family was Giovanni de' Bici de' Medici, 1360–1429. Who amassed a large fortune through his skill in trade and who virtually ruled Florence between 1421 and 1429. Later, Lorenzo de' Medici, 1449–1492, ruled Florence between 1478 and 1492. Though he was tyrannical, he was a great patron of the arts and letters. Lorenzo, also called the Magnificent, maintained Fiesole, a villa outside Florence, where he surrounded himself with the great talents and thinkers of Florence, including a young artist named Sandro Botticelli, 1445–1510. Lorenzo was also a patron of Michelangelo.
Why is Botticelli's The Birth of Venus famous?
This immediately recognizable painting, c. 1482, is most likely known for its elegant figures, use of pictorial space, and decorative detail, which give the painting a tapestry effect. At the time it was painted, the presentation of a nude Venus was an innovation since the use of unclothed figures in art had been prohibited during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. Botticelli, however, felt free to render Venus in this way since the work was commissioned by Florence's powerful Medici family, who were his patrons. Under their protection, Botticelli could pursue the world of his imagination without fearing charges of paganism and infidelity. Though the birth of Venus is extremely well known, the Magnificat, 1483. Botticelli's round picture of the Madonna with singing angels, is his most copied work.
What impact have VCRs and digital recorders had on television viewing?
Since VCRs, invented 1975, and the more recent digital recorders such as TiVo give viewers the ability to record television programs and watch them when they choose, a phenomenon known as time shifting has emerged. As Americans watch previously recorded programming, they miss primetime broadcasts. Commentators mused that Americans were losing a sense of community. Gone were the days when office workers would stand around the water cooler to chat about last night's episode of a popular program. Since these recording devices also gave viewers the ability to fast forward through commercials, a practice dubbed zapping, they posed challenges to the advertising industry.
Is there a golden age of television?
Yes, people commonly refer to the 1950s as TV's golden age, which is the decade when Americans embraced television and the networks responded with the rapid expansion of programming. Critics still hail the programs of the golden age to be the most innovative programming in television history. It was during this decade that anthology programs such as Kraft Television Theater, Playhouse 90, and Studio One made live drama part of the nightly fare on primetime television. Americans could tune in to watch original screenplays such as 12 Angry Men, 1954, Visit to a Small Planet, 1955, and The Miracle Worker, 1957. And tune in they did, prompting the production of more than 30 anthology programs sponsored by the likes of Goodyear, Philco, U.S. Steel, Breck, and Schlitz. Since the production work was based in New York, the anthologies drew young playwrights including Gore Vidal, Rod Serling, Arthur Miller, and A.E. Hotchner. A new group of prominent television directors and producers emerged, and the studio dramas attracted the talents of actors George C. Scott, James Dean, Paul Newman, Grace Kelly, Eva Marie Saint, Sidney Poitier, Lee Remick, and Jack Lemmon. The other cornerstone of 1950 television programming was the variety show, also done live. Comedians Jack Benny, Red Skelton, Jackie Gleason, George Burns, Sid Caesar, and Mr. Television Milton Berle thrived in the format. But the cost of producing live programs and the growing popularity of television, which created a new mass market that demanded even more programming, combined to spell the end of television's golden age. Soon, live dramas and variety shows were replaced by situation comedies, westerns, and other set-staged programs that could be taped in advance, and could be produced in quantity.
How did the novel develop?
Critics and scholars agree that it is French writer Gustave Flaubert, 1821 to 1880, who developed the modern novel into a conscious art form. Flaubert's Madame Bovary is recognized for its objective characterization, irony, narrative technique, and use of imagery and symbolism. American writer, and naturalized British citizen, Henry James, 1843 to 1916, is acknowledged for having enlarged the scope of the novel, introducing dramatic elements to the narrative, developing point of view technique, and advocating realism in literature. James's works include The American, 1877, Daisy Miller, 1879. The Portrait of a Lady, 1881, and The Ambassadors, 1903. Irish writer James Joyce, 1882 to 1941, considered the most prominent English-speaking literary figure of the first half of the 20th century, is often credited with redefining the modern novel. Joyce experimented with the form and revolutionized it through his first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916, and with his masterpiece, Ulysses, 1922. In which he developed the techniques of interior monologue and stream of conscious narrative. Writer William Faulkner, 1897 to 1962, was the American counterpart to Joyce's experimentation with the form of the novel. The author of The Sound and the Fury, 1929, Light in August, 1932, and Absalom, 1936, among others. Faulkner, in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949, stated that the fundamental theme of his fiction is the human heart in conflict with itself. This he explored by employing a variety of narrative techniques, which, like Joyce's, departed radically from traditional methods.
Is Stravinsky the 20th century's foremost composer?
The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky, 1882 to 1971, is certainly one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Stravinsky wrote concerts, chamber music, piano pieces, and operas, as well as ballets, for which he may be most well known. Between 1903 and 1906 Stravinsky studied under the great Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844 to 1908. In 1908 Stravinsky wrote his first work of note, the orchestral fantasy Fireworks, which was in honor of the marriage of Rimsky-Korsakov's daughter. The piece caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, 1872 to 1929, of the ballets Russes, who invited the young composer to participate in the ballet company's 1910 season. Ballets Russes had dazzled audiences the year before, bringing new energy to the art form. In collaboration with Diaghilev, Stravinsky went on to create masterpieces The Firebird, 1910, Petrushka, 1911, and Rite of Spring, 1913, among them. The partnership served to elevate the role of the ballet composer in the art world. Rite of Spring is either Stravinsky's most famous or most infamous work. It was first performed by the ballets Russes in the third week of its 1913 season. The choreography was arranged by the famous dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, 1890 to 1950. But the performance stunned both the music and dance worlds. So extreme was the audience's reaction to this premiere work that a riot nearly broke out inside the theater. Stravinsky had composed his music not to express spring's idyllic qualities but rather its turmoil and dissonance similar to childbirth. Nijinsky paired Stravinsky's composition with complicated and visually frenzied dance movements, later characterized by the composer as a jumping competition. Though many thought it a disastrous performance, when the ballets Russes continued to London, Rite of Spring was more widely accepted there largely because the audience had been duly prepared for it. The following year, Rite of Spring was performed in concert in Russia, but the reaction was mixed. The young composer Sergei Prokofiev, 1891 to 1953, was in the audience and later wrote that he had been so moved by the work that he could not recover from the effects. Listeners today are still moved by the elevated rhythm of Rite of Spring, which makes an entire orchestra into a kind of sustained percussion instrument. Ultimately, most musicians and critics came to regard the watershed work as one of the finest compositions of the 20th century.
Who was more important to rock and roll, Elvis Presley or the Beatles?
While music historians and fans of either or both may be willing to offer an opinion, the question cannot be definitively answered. The fact is that popular music today would not be what it is had it not been for both Elvis Presley and the Beatles. And the influences of both are still felt. Elvis Presley, 1935 to 1977, brought to music an exciting and fresh combination of country, gospel, blues, and rhythm and blues music, and topped it all off with a style and sense of showmanship that dazzled young audiences. His first commercial recording was That's All Right, Mama in 1954, which was followed in 1956 by the success of Heartbreak Hotel. Between 1956 and 1969 he had 17 #1 records. Presley defined a new musical style and an era. Among those the American Presley had influenced were 4 English musicians who called themselves the Beatles. Originally founded as the Quarrymen by John Lennon, 1940 to 1980, in 1956. The group became the most popular rock and roll band of the 1960s. Their first single was Love Me Do, released on October 5, 1962, and producer George Martin was encouraged that the Beatles could produce a #1 record. In 1963 they did. Please Please Me was released in Britain on January 12 and was an immediate hit. Other hits off their first album included She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. The follow-up album, With the Beatles, was released in 1964 and established them as Britain's favorite group. Already popular in their homeland, Beatlemania began in the United States on February 7, 1964, when the mop-topped Fab Four, Lennon along with Paul McCartney, b. 1942, George Harrison, 1943 to 2001, and Ringo Starr, b. 1940, arrived at New York's Kennedy International Airport and were met by a mob of more than 10,000 screaming fans and 110 police officers. 2 days later, on February 9, the Beatles made their legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. By April the group held onto the top 5 positions on the US singles charts. The British invasion had begun. In their early years, the Beatles brought a new energy to rock and roll and picked up where Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard had left off. The instrumentation and orchestration of Beatles songs, for which their producer George Martin deserves at least some of the credit, were innovative at the time, and are common for rock music today. Their rock movies, A Hard Day's Night, 1964, and Help, 1965, were a precursor to the music videos of today. When the band decided to break up, the April 10, 1970, announcement proved to be the end of an era.
Why did Schoenberg face sharp criticism in his day?
The Vienna-born American composer Arnold Schoenberg, 1874 to 1951. Now considered one of the great masters of the 20th century, was derided for having thrown out the rules of composition for working outside the confines of traditional harmony. In his youth, he was a fan of Wagner's compositions, seeing each of his major operas repeatedly. A series of Schoenberg's early works reflect the Wagnerian influence. But just after the turn of the century, Schoenberg set out on his own path. The result was the 1909 composition Three Pieces for Piano, which some music historians argue is the single most important composition of the 20th century. The work is atonal, which is to say it is organized without reference to key. Schoenberg abandoned the techniques of musical expression, as they had been understood for hundreds of years. This was no small moment for the music world, and many reacted with vocal and vehement criticism. Of the outcry, Schoenberg remarked in 1947 that it was as if I had fallen into an ocean of boiling water. But he had his followers, too, among them his students. Though he was essentially self-taught as a composer, he became one of the most influential teachers of his time. It's interesting to note, however, that his teaching approach was grounded in the traditional practices of tonal harmony. He later brought order to the chaos of atonalism by developing a 12-tone serialism, showing how entire compositions could be organized around an ordained sequence of 12 notes. However, he never taught the method and rarely lectured or wrote about it.
What are the characteristics of Botticelli's paintings?
The works of Sandro Botticelli, 1445 to 1510, one of the early painters of the Italian Renaissance, are known for their serene compositions, refined elegance, and spirituality. A student of Florentine painter Fra Filippo Lippi, 1406 to 1469. Botticelli refined Lippi's method of drawing such that he is considered one of the great masters of the line. Botticelli's work was soon eclipsed by that of Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. Who was just a few years younger than he, but whose range of talents made Botticelli's work seem dated. Nevertheless, late in the 19th century, Botticelli began to be revered again by artists and critics alike, who hailed his works for their simplicity and sincerity. English art critic John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, held Botticelli up as an example of an artist who presented nature as an expression of a divinely created world.
When did the big band era begin?
On December 1, 1934, Benny Goodman's Let's Dance was broadcast on network radio, which effectively launched the swing era, in which big band music achieved huge popularity. Goodman, 1909 to 1986, was a virtuoso clarinetist and bandleader. His jazz-influenced dance band took the lead in making swing the most popular style of the time.
What was the impact of network television?
The big three networks rose to power in the 1950s and dominated television for the next 2 decades. During much of this period, they captured more than 90% of the total viewing audience. Americans had turned away from the radio programs and films that had diverted them in the post-war 1940s and were tuning into television the tube at an average rate of 25 hours per week. leaving little time for any other recreational pursuits. In short, television had become not only an American pastime, but an American obsession. Radio, which had given birth to television, both NBC and CBS were radio networks before they began developing TV programming, saw its revenue cut in half almost overnight. It not only lost audiences and advertisers to TV, but lost popular programs and stars as well. Radio turned its attention to an emerging new art form, rock and roll. The move was a success, as young listeners tuned in to hear the music that was considered too raw to be included in the evening TV lineup. Film felt the effects of television as well, as audiences stayed home to be entertained. Movie makers attempted to lure audiences back into the theaters with gimmicks including 3D movies, Panavision, Cinemascope, and Circle Vision. Hollywood abandoned the Western and other B-movies in favor of big-budget blockbusters, many of which were filmed on location rather than at studios or on backlots. Studios even forbade their stars from appearing on TV, but they soon relented. Cooperation between the two industries is what saved film. Studios sold old movies to the networks for broadcast and provided production talent and facilities to television. Newspapers were least affected by the tremendous popularity of television. Since programming time was at first limited to 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., which still left time to read the paper. As soon as television expanded programming beyond that 3-hour window, however, newspapers felt the pinch more sharply in 1963, when both CBS and NBC began airing news shows. Daytime programming spelled the demise of the evening paper. While television had no impact on the number of books published, it did prompt a decrease in the number of fiction titles that were published, and a corresponding increase in the number of non-fiction titles. The upward trend of non-fiction titles is a lasting effect of television on the publishing industry. Today experts disagree over the impact of television on our lives. Some argue that increased crime is a direct outcome of television since programs show crime as an everyday event and advertisements make people more aware of what they don't have. Critics also maintain that television stimulates aggressive behavior, reinforces ethnic stereotyping, and leads to a decrease in activity and creativity. Proponents of television counter, citing increased awareness in world events, improved verbal abilities, and greater curiosity as benefits of television viewing. By the end of the 1950s, more than 50 million American families owned a television.
What were the lasting effects of the Harlem Renaissance?
The Harlem Renaissance, 1925 to 35, marked the first time that white Americans, principally intellects and artists, gave serious attention to the culture of African Americans. The movement, which had by some accounts begun as early as 1917, was noted in a 1925 New York Herald Tribune article that announced, We are on the edge. If not in the midst, of what might not improperly be called a Negro Renaissance. The first African-American Rhodes Scholar, Alain Locke, 1886–1954. Who was a professor of philosophy at Howard University, led and shaped the movement during which Upper Manhattan became a hotbed of creativity in the post-World War I, 1914–18, era. Not only was there a flurry activity, but there was a heightened sense of pride as well. The movement left the country with a legacy of literary works including those by Jean Toomer. His 1923 work Cain is generally considered the first work of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes. The Negro Speaks of Rivers, 1921, The Weary Blues, 1926, County Cullen, Color, 1925, Copper Sun, 1927, Jesse R. Fawcett, novelist and editor of The Crisis, the Journal of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Or NAACP, Claude McKay, whose 1928 novel Home to Harlem evokes strong criticism from W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke for its portrayal of black life, and Zora Neale Hurston. The author of the highly acclaimed 1937 novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. Who was the first black woman to be honored for her creative writing with the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. The Harlem Renaissance was not only about literature. Jazz and blues music also flourished during the prosperous times of the post-war era. During the 1920s and 1930s, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Josephine Baker rose to prominence. Their contributions to music performance are still felt by artists and audiences. Regardless of color, today.
Is blues music older than jazz?
Only slightly, and only if your definition of jazz doesn't include ragtime. Really, the two musical traditions developed side by side, with blues emerging about the first decade of the 1900s and hitting the height of its early popularity in 1920s Harlem, where the songs were seen as an expression of African American life. Great blues singers like Ma Rainey, 1886–1939, and Bessie Smith, 1894 or 1898–1937, sang of the black reality determined but weary. During the Harlem Renaissance, the music was a symbol for African American people who were struggling to be accepted for who they were. Poet Langston Hughes, 1902–1967, saw the blues as a distinctly black musical genre, and as helping to free blacks from American standardization. As the first person to codify and publish blues songs, American musician and composer W.C. Handy, 1873–1958, is considered the father of the blues. The Florence, Alabama, native produced a number of well-known works, including Memphis Blues, St. Louis Blues, which is one of the most frequently recorded songs in popular music, Beale Street Blues, and Careless Love.
Which was the first TV network?
It was the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, founded November 11, 1926, by David Sarnoff. 1891 to 1971, who was then President of Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Sarnoff, considered one of the pioneers of radio and television broadcasting. Created NBC to provide a program service to stimulate the sale of radios. In the 1940s he reorganized the network to provide TV programming. Again to stimulate sales of RCA products, this time, televisions. It was Sarnoff who demonstrated television at the World's Fair in New York in 1939. Next came Columbia Broadcasting System. CBS, on September 26, 1928, which was established by William S. Paley, 1901 to 1990, an advertising manager for Congress Cigar Company. Paley sold some of his stock in the cigar company in order to raise $275,000 to buy into the beleaguered United Independent Broadcasters, which controlled Columbia Phonograph, hence the name. He built the floundering radio network into a powerful and profitable broadcasting organization. The American Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, television network was last. In 1943, it was only by government order that the third network, ABC, was created at all. In 1943, when RCA was ordered to give up one of its two radio networks, it surrendered the weaker of the two, NBC Blue, which was bought by Edward J. Noble, the father of Lifesavers Candy. In 1945 Noble formally changed the name to the American Broadcasting Company, which 3 years later began broadcasting television from its New York flagship station.
Is bluegrass music a distinctly American genre?
Yes, the style of music developed out of country music during the late 1930s and throughout the 1940s. Bill Monroe, 1911 to 1996, a country and bluegrass singer-songwriter, altered the tempo, key, pitch, and instrumentation of traditional country music to create a new style named for the band that originated it. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe's home state was Kentucky. Bluegrass was first heard by a wide audience when in October 1939. Monroe and his band appeared on the popular country music radio program The Grand Ole Opry. Although bluegrass evolved through several stages and involved a host of contributors, through it all Bill Monroe remained the guiding and inspirational force, and therefore merits the distinction of being the father of bluegrass.
Who invented jazz?
Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, 1885 to 1941, a New Orleans pianist, claimed credit for having invented jazz. And to some degree, it was fair of him to think so after all, his recordings with the group the Red Hot Peppers. 1926–30, are among the earliest examples of disciplined jazz ensemble work. But in truth, the evolution of jazz from ragtime and blues was something that many musicians in several cities took part in. Most regard Morton as one of the founders of jazz. The other founders include Benny Moten (1894–1935), U.B. Blake (1883–1983), Duke Ellington (1899–1974), and Thomas Fats Waller (1904–1943). Some would go back even farther to trace the roots of jazz, from 1899 to 1914 Scott Joplin, 1868 to 1917, popularized ragtime, which was based on African folk music. Even astute music critics may not be able to draw a clear-cut distinction between ragtime and early jazz. Both musical forms rely on syncopation, the stressing of the weak beats. And either style can be applied to an existing melody and transform it. The definitions and boundaries of the two terms have always been subject to debate, which is further complicated by the fact that some musicians of the time considered ragtime to be more or less a synonym for early jazz. But there are important, albeit not strict, differences between the two genres as well. Rags were composed and written down in the European style of notation, while early jazz was learned by ear. Players would simply show one another how a song went by playing it. Jazz encourages and expects improvisation, whereas ragtime, for the most part, did not. And the basic rhythms are also markedly different, with jazz having a swing or hot rhythm that ragtime does not. Whatever its origins, jazz became part of the musical mainstream by the 1930s and influenced other musical genres as well, including classical. American composer George Gershwin, 1898–1937, was both a songwriter and composer of rags as well as a composer of symphonic works. Many of his works, including Rhapsody in Blue, 1924, and his piano preludes, contain ragtime and jazz elements. Perhaps more than any other composer and musician, Miles Davis, 1926–1991, expanded the genre, through decades of prolific work. Davis constantly pushed the boundaries of what defines jazz and in so doing set standards for other musicians.
Why is the ballet's Russes famous?
The notoriety of the ballet's Russes began on a May night in 1909. It was then that the company, created by Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev, 1872–1929, performed innovative ballet choreographed by Michel Faucon, 1880–1942. The Parisian audience, made up of the city's elite, was wowed by the choreography, set design, and musical scores, as well as the performances of the lead dancers, the athletic vigor of Vaslav Nijinsky. The delicate beauty of Tamara Karsavina, the expressiveness of Anna Pavlova, and the exotic quality of Ida Rubinstein. Ballet had been freed of the constraints and conventions that had held it captive. The art form was reawakened. The reforms were on every level: choreography, performance, costuming, and design. The company's chief set designer was Leon Bakst, 1866 to 1924, whose sense of color had influenced not only stage designs but even women's fashions. Soon Diaghilev and the ballets Russes were at the center of the art world. Major 20th-century painters, including Robert Edmond Jones, Pablo Picasso, André Derain, Henri Matisse, and Joan Miro, created set and costume designs for the dance company. And Diaghilev commissioned music that could match the spectacular dancing, choreography, and decor of his ballets. History's most celebrated composers, including Maurice Ravel, Claude Debussy, Richard Strauss, Sergei Prokofiev, and Igor Stravinsky, provided the scores for the dances performed by Ballets Russes. The company, under Diaghilev's direction, had created a completely different kind of dance drama, bringing ballet out of the shadows of opera and asserting it as an art form unto itself. The ballet companies of today are the lasting legacy of the Ballets Russes. Diaghilev illustrated that through a collaborative process, excellent art could be created outside the traditional academy. The Ballets Russes provided 20th-century dance with the model of the touring ballet company and seasonal repertory.
How old is country music?
Old-time music or hillbilly music, both early names for country music, emerged in the early decades of the 1900s. By 1920 the first country music radio stations had opened, and healthy record sales in rural areas caused music industry executives to take notice. But it was an event in 1925, in the middle of the American Jazz Age, that put country music on the map. On November 28, WSM Radio broadcast the WSM Barn Dance, which soon became known as the Grand Ole Opry when the Master of Ceremonies, George D. Hay, took to introducing the program that way since it was aired immediately after an opera program. The show's first performer was Uncle Jimmy Thompson, 1848 to 1931. Early favorites included Uncle Dave Macon, 1870 to 1952, who played the banjo and sang, and Roy Acuff, 1903 to 1992, who was the Opry's first singing star. Millions tuned in, and soon the Nashville-based show had turned Tennessee's capital city into music city, USA. In the 1960s and again in the late 1980s and 1990s, country music reached the height of popularity. While holding on to its small-town, rural-based audience who were the show's first fans.
What was the immediate impact of television?
The publicity surrounding the World's Fair television broadcast, April 30, 1939. Inspired a flurry of broadcasting activity but reached limited audiences. On May 17, the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, televised a baseball game between Princeton University and Columbia University, which NBC billed as the world's first televised sporting event. On August 26, NBC telecast a professional baseball game between the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Cincinnati Reds. More NBC broadcasts from Radio City featured live opera, comedy, and cooking demonstrations. Crowds waiting outside the 1939 New York premiere of Gone with the Wind were also televised. Feature films were aired, including a dramatization of Treasure Island, Young and Beautiful, and the classic silent film The Great Train Robbery, 1903. Soon television stations had proliferated. By May 1940, 23 stations were broadcasting. In 1941, after considerable deliberation on its part and that of the industry itself, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, adopted transmission standards. Commercial operations were approved effective July 1, and 2 New York stations, National Broadcasting Company, NBC, and Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, affiliates, went on the air. By the end of that year, the first commercial on television, financed by watch manufacturer Bulova, was aired. In December, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into World War II, 1939–45, commercial development of television was put on hold while American industry devoted its resources to the war effort. But the television industry was eager, and as soon as Allied victory looked like a sure thing, Radio Corporation of American, RCA, reopened its NBC television studio on April 10, 1944. CBS followed suit, reopening its operations on May 5. At the war's end in 1945, 9 part-time and partly commercial television stations were on the air, reaching about 7,500 set owners in the New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Schenectady, New York. By 1947, the 4 networks that then existed, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Dumont, a short-lived competitor, could still provide only about 10 hours of prime-time programming a week, much of it sporting events. In late 1948, it was estimated that only 10% of the population had even seen a television show. However, as the networks stepped up their programming with live drama programs, children's shows, and variety shows, a format that was familiar and popular to the American radio listening audience, interest in television grew rapidly. By the spring of 1948, industry experts estimated that 150,000 sets were in public places such as bars and pubs, accounting for about half of the total number of sets in operation. Just a year later, 940,000 homes had televisions. And by 1949, production of sets had jumped to 3 million.
When was poker invented?
The card game, in which a player bets that the value of his or her hand is higher than those held by the other players. Was invented in the 1820s by sailors in New Orleans. The sailors combined the ancient Persian game as NAS with the French game POC, which itself was a derivation of the Italian game Primera, and a cousin of the English game Brag. Poker was originally played with 3 cards from a deck of only 32 and included combinations such as pairs and 3 of a kind. The game was later played with 5 cards from a deck of 52 cards, and the draw was also added. Stud poker, where each player is dealt their first card face down and the next 4 cards face up, didn't come into existence for many years, until about 1864. Other later additions to the game were the straight, a hand consisting of 5 cards in sequence but not of the same suit, and the flush, a hand consisting of 5 cards of the same suit but not in sequence.
When was poker invented?
The card game, in which a player bets that the value of his or her hand is higher than those held by the other players, was invented in the 1820s by sailors in New Orleans. The sailors combined the ancient Persian game as NAS with the French game POC, which itself was a derivation of the Italian game Primera, and a cousin of the English game Brag. Poker was originally played with 3 cards from a deck of only 32 and included combinations such as pairs and 3 of a kind. The game was later played with 5 cards from a deck of 52 cards, and the draw was also added. Stud poker, where each player is dealt their first card face down and the next 4 cards face up, didn't come into existence for many years, until about 1864. Other later additions to the game were the straight, a hand consisting of 5 cards in sequence but not of the same suit, and the flush, a hand consisting of 5 cards of the same suit but not in sequence.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884 to 1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a Challenge match at London's Almack's Club, the match was highly publicised.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884 to 1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a challenge match at London's Almack's Club. The match was highly publicised.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase according to Hoyle.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase according to Hoyle.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages. 500-1350.
How old is chess?
It dates to the Middle Ages. In 1283 Alfonso X, 1221 to 1284, King of Castile and Leon, Spain, commissioned the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, Book of Chess, Dice, and Backgammon, based on an Arabic text. This book is still considered an important source on leisure activities in the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
When were the first Olympic Games?
The Olympics date to about 900 BC, when, in ancient Greece, tens of thousands of sandal-wearing spectators descended on Olympia to cheer the runners, wrestlers, and bare-skinned boxers competing there. The Games at Olympia were one of 4 athletic festivals in Greece, the others being the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, and the Pythian Games at Delphi, all of which alternated to form the Periodos, or circuits, which guaranteed sports fans the opportunity to attend an athletic festival every year. Winning was everything then. Athletes were required to register in order to compete, and rumors of Herculean opponents sometimes prompted competitors to withdraw. Victors were awarded crowns of olive leaves, and the second and third place finishers returned home undecorated. The modern Olympic Games, begun by diminutive Frenchman Baron Pierre de Coubertin, 1862 to 1937, possess a decidedly different spirit than did their ancient counterpart, where the only rules were that participants were not allowed to gouge, bite, put a knee to the groin, strangle, or throw sand at their opponent. The modern Olympic Games, publicly proposed by Coubertin on November 25, 1892, in Paris, and first held in Athens, Greece, in 1896, are based on their initiators' vision of the Olympic competition as an occasion to promote peace, harmony, and internationalism. In April 1896, some 40,000 spectators pressed into the Panathinaean Stadium, which had been constructed on the site of an ancient stadium in Athens, to witness the athletic feats of the first modern Olympic heroes. 13 nations participated, only male athletes, just more than 300 of them competed, and Greece received the most medals, 47. The second Olympic Games were held in 1900 in Paris.
When were the first Olympic Games?
The Olympics date to about 900 B. C. When, in ancient Greece, tens of thousands of sandal-wearing spectators descended on Olympia to cheer the runners, wrestlers, and bare-skinned boxers competing there. The Games at Olympia were one of 4 athletic festivals in Greece, the others being the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, and the Pythian Games at Delphi, all of which alternated to form the periodos, or circuits, which guaranteed sports fans the opportunity to attend an athletic festival every year. Winning was everything then. Athletes were required to register in order to compete, and rumors of Herculean opponents sometimes prompted competitors to withdraw. Victors were awarded crowns of olive leaves, and the second and third place finishers returned home undecorated. The modern Olympic Games, begun by diminutive Frenchman Baron Pierre de Coubertin, 1862 to 1937, possess a decidedly different spirit than did their ancient counterpart, where the only rules were that participants were not allowed to gouge, bite, put a knee to the groin, strangle, or throw sand at their opponent. The modern Olympic Games, publicly proposed by Coubertin on November 25, 1892, in Paris, and first held in Athens, Greece, in 1896, are based on their initiators' vision of the Olympic competition as an occasion to promote peace, harmony, and internationalism. In April 1896, some 40,000 spectators pressed into the Panathinaean Stadium, which had been constructed on the site of an ancient stadium in Athens, to witness the athletic feats of the first modern Olympic heroes. 13 nations participated, only male athletes, just more than 300 of them competed, and Greece received the most medals, 47. The second Olympic Games were held in 1900 in Paris.
When were the first Winter Games held?
The Winter Olympic Games had a slow birth, making their first official appearance almost 3 decades after the first modern games were held in Athens, 1896. In 1901 Nordic Games were held in Sweden. However, only Scandinavian countries participated in the events, which organizers intended to hold every 4 years. The Nordic Games constituted the first organized international competition involving winter sports. Then, as part of the Summer Olympic Games in 1908, host city London held a figure skating competition that October. 3 years later, an Italian member of the International Olympic Committee, IOC, encouraged Sweden, the next host of the Summer Games, to include winter sports in 1912 or hold a separate event for them. Since Sweden already played host to the Nordic Games, they declined to pursue the IOC suggestion. The 6th Olympiad was slated to be held in 1916 in Berlin, and Germany vowed to stage winter sports competition as part of the event. But in 1914 World War I began, and the Berlin Games were cancelled altogether. After an 8-year hiatus, the Olympics resumed in 1920, Antwerp, Belgium. Played host to athletes, which included figure skaters and ice hockey players along with the usual contingency of gymnasts, runners, fencers, and other summer sports competitors. The first IOC-sanctioned competition of winter sports was held in Chamonix, France, from January 25 to February 4, 1924. When the games were staged next, in St. Moritz, Switzerland, in 1928, they were formally designated the Second Winter Olympics. From that year, the Winter Games were held every 4 years in the same calendar year, as the Summer Games until 1994. In 1986 IOC officials voted to change the schedule. The result was that the 1992 Winter Olympics in Albertville, France, were followed only 2 years later by the Games in Lillehammer, Norway. The Winter and Summer Games are now each held every 4 years, alternating in even-numbered years.
When were the first Winter Games held?
The Winter Olympic Games had a slow birth, making their first official appearance almost 3 decades after the first modern games were held in Athens, 1896. In 1901 Nordic Games were held in Sweden. However, only Scandinavian countries participated in the events, which organizers intended to hold every 4 years. The Nordic Games constituted the first organized international competition involving winter sports. Then, as part of the Summer Olympic Games in 1908, host city London held a figure skating competition that October. 3 years later, an Italian member of the International Olympic Committee, IOC, encouraged Sweden, the next host of the Summer Games, to include winter sports in 1912 or hold a separate event for them. Since Sweden already played host to the Nordic Games, they declined to pursue the IOC suggestion. The sixth Olympiad was slated to be held in 1916 in Berlin, and Germany vowed to stage winter sports competition as part of the event. But in 1914 World War I began, and the Berlin Games were cancelled altogether. After an 8-year hiatus, the Olympics resumed in 1920, Antwerp, Belgium. Played host to athletes, which included figure skaters and ice hockey players along with the usual contingency of gymnasts, runners, fencers, and other summer sports competitors. The first IOC-sanctioned competition of winter sports was held in Chamonix, France, from January 25 to February 4, 1924. When the games were staged next, in St. Moritz, Switzerland, in 1928, they were formally designated the Second Winter Olympics. From that year, the Winter Games were held every 4 years in the same calendar year, as the Summer Games until 1994. In 1986 IOC officials voted to change the schedule. The result was that the 1992 Winter Olympics in Albertville, France, were followed only 2 years later by the Games in Lillehammer, Norway. The Winter and Summer Games are now each held every 4 years, alternating in even-numbered years.